Who am I? You sure you want to know? The story of my life is not for the faint of heart.
I've been a huge fan of Spider-Man since I was a young kid. I love the original trilogy and even tried my hardest to like the Amazing Spider-Man duology. On top of that, as a young comic geek, I really loved the Amazing Spider-Man, Ultimate Spider-Man, and pretty much anything Spider-Man I could get my hands on in the comics. And seeing as Sony is making a new Spider-Man this year with No Way Home, that people are getting pretty excited for, I figured I'd capitalize on this wave of nostalgia by reviewing every Spider-Man film. Spider-Man was part of the first major push by Hollywood to start marketing Marvel's IP into film, along with titles like X-Men, Hulk, and Blade. The story is pretty basic. Peter Parker gets bitten by a special spider, Uncle Ben gets shot and dies, and thus Peter learns to be the responsible hero, Spider-Man. Meanwhile, Norman Osborn, the father of Peter's best friend, does an experiment on himself which makes him crazy, and he becomes the Green Goblin. Then he learns of a corporate takeover from another company, and he kills his board of directors. After this, his motives are pretty much unknown, but what we do know is that he wants to kill Spider-Man or have him join him. So they fight and Green Goblin dies. This film has a lot of issues, but I still love it. I guess I'll start with my critiques. For one, it has a lot of really early 2000s graphics, like when Peter gets bit and his DNA is being rewritten. Speaking of corny, the dialogue is a little stilted.
That's a cute outfit. Did your husband give it to you?
Some of the humor is a bit dated too, as you can see. And isn't it a huge coincidence that Peter and his best friend's dad both become superhero and supervillain respectively on the same day?
You know, I'm something of a scientist myself.
As I've alluded to, Norman accomplishes all of his goals as Goblin in the first half of the film, killing his board of directors and screwing the other company out of its military contract by bombing their prototype. So the film doesn't really know what to do with him besides make him want to kill Spider-Man after that point. Hell, Peter's more interested in Mary Jane than actually catching Green Goblin, so why Goblin wants Spider-Man dead so bad really doesn't make sense to me. Going into the positives, I think the stilted dialogue and cornball performances actually have its charm and adds to the tone of the film. Especially in the scenes where Peter is swooning over Mary Jane, anything with J.K. Simmons as J. Jonah Jameson, and of course whenever William Dafoe is on screen as Norman, especially in the scenes where he plays both Green Goblin and Norman arguing with each other. I love the corny-ass scene where Spider-Man is backed up by New York. It gives me chills, even though realistically, if anyone saw this man drop a trolley car from a bridge on his rocket-powered missile glider, they would run the fuck away. The fights are pretty great too, especially the wrestling fight towards the start against Bonesaw, and the film moves at a lightning pace with no dead air or wasted space. Overall, I really love the first Spider-Man film despite its really huge and really blatant flaws, as I think in a way it's just trying to be a fun film, as I don't think it's concerned with the plot or being realistic. I think the film has its own eternal logic. I think it's just a really fun camp fest and definitely worth a watch.
Pizza time.
Spider-Man 2 is one of the rare sequels which surpasses the first entry's acclaim by most critics. And I'm not here to break the mold. Spider-Man 2, in my opinion, is the best of the Sam Raimi trilogy. In this film, we start off with little change to the status quo. Peter Parker's still a loser who's having a hard time balancing his life as Spider-Man with his life as Peter Parker, to the point where he gets fired from his pizza job.
Pizza time.
And his grades are starting to falter. This leads to his teacher, Dr. Connors, confronting Peter, who says he's writing a paper on Otto Octavius, who conveniently his friend Harry is funding, so Peter has a chance to see Otto make his artificial sun thing, but it goes wrong and Otto is fused with the Dr. Octopus arms, and the inhibitor keeping him in control of the arms breaks, causing him to go evil, and antics ensue. Harry hires Octopus to kill Spider-Man for more of the MacGuffin element that will allow him to create the second artificial sun, so Spider-Man and Doc Ock start fighting. This eventually climaxes with MJ being captured, the sun being created, and Peter being outed as Spider-Man to Mary Jane, Doc Ock, and Harry. Octavius is able to regain control of his arms and stop the artificial sun, but it costs him his life. This film really continues the melodramatic soap opera story that the first film has. Mary Jane is about to marry John Jameson, J. Jonah Jameson's astronaut son. Meanwhile, we also have Harry, who is growing distant from Peter, as he knows Peter knows Spider-Man through his photography, and he views Spider-Man as having killed his father. This is really at the core of the film, this melodrama, and I think it's handled best in this film when compared to the rest of the trilogy. The film retains a lot of the camp we saw in the previous film, but tones it down quite a bit in favor of taking the drama more seriously. I also think that ties into Alfred Molina's Doc Ock, who's a much more grounded character than the comparatively over-the-top performance Dafoe brought in his performance as Green Goblin, which I enjoyed quite a bit. The supporting cast is expanded a bit, adding Peter's slumpy landlord and his daughter, who are both fun additions and add some levity to the film, which I think helps the film as a whole from being taken too seriously. In addition, we still have J.K. Simmons' amazing and funny portrayal as J. Jonah Jameson, who is just iconic in these films. This film packs a lot of great set pieces and fight scenes, with the train fight being a particular high point of the film, and the final warehouse scene also being really cool. Another awesome set piece is after Octavius is linked with his mechanical arms. He destroys a hospital in a sequence that feels right out of Raimi's horror days in both composition and editing, and you can feel how much fun he had putting the scene together. I don't think this film is perfect though, and it does have some major flaws. Again, seemingly everything in this world revolves around Peter and his drama, which I will note is a problem with the Spider-Man character in general. This will be brought up again in all the subsequent Spider-Man franchises, including the Amazing Spider-Man, the MCU Spider-Man, as well as Into the Spider-Verse. In this film, Peter meets Octavius before he becomes Doc Ock, and is in the building when it happens. J. Jonah Jameson's son happens to be marrying MJ of all people. This isn't a huge deal since it's kind of the nature of the franchise, but it does make me roll my eyes a little bit, honestly. On top of that, Peter losing his powers felt a little unnecessary, as I think they could have just had Peter quit being Spider-Man during the second act, simply because he feels Harry hates him and he missed out on dating Mary Jane. It doesn't really have to connect to him losing his powers, as he kind of just gets them back anyhow, but again, this is a somewhat small issue I have with the film. On the other hand, I do like that Peter has to grapple with what he wants versus the responsibility he's given. There's a scene where he imagines talking to Uncle Ben about living his own life and not needing Spider-Man anymore, and Peter is clearly aware that his decision may let down Ben, but it needs to happen for him to be happy. And it feels like a big moment for Peter when he finally decides to don the suit once again. In the first film, I complained that Goblin didn't really have a motive to want Spider-Man dead, and this film levitied that by having Harry offer Doc Ock the MacGuffin element he needed to deliver him Spider-Man. Because much like Goblin, it doesn't really help his goals to want Spider-Man dead, but at least in this film there's more of a reason than he simply wants Spider-Man dead for fun or whatever. Much like the first film, it's fast-paced with very little dead air that needed to be cut. Overall, Spider-Man 2 is a very good film with enough humor to keep it fun, but also with a lot of good action and the best handling of Peter's everyday drama in the series.
I come before you today, humbled and humiliated, to ask you for one thing. I want you to kill Peter Parker.
Spider-Man 3 is the definitive worst film in the trilogy, but I really don't understand all the hate outside of emo Peter and perhaps Topher Grace's Venom. Anyhow, Peter and MJ are happily dating, and Harry still wants Peter dead after learning that he's Spider-Man. Anyhow, Harry confronts Peter as the new Goblin and gets his second severe head injury of the series, causing him to lose part of his memory, and he becomes friends with Peter again. Meanwhile, the Venom symbiote Space Rock lands on Earth and attaches itself to Peter. MJ becomes mad because Peter's successful and her play received bad reviews. Flint Marko becomes Sandman, and as it turns out, he was Uncle Ben's true killer, so Peter wants revenge, and Venom attaches itself to Peter's suit, causing him to be more powerful, but also more vengeful. He thinks he kills Flint and learns some wisdom from Aunt May, so he removes the symbiote suit, which happens to land on Eddie Brock, who Peter, in his vengeful phase, embarrassed. Anyhow, he becomes Venom and teams up with Sandman to capture MJ. Meanwhile, Harry gets his memory back and tries killing Peter, but Peter fucks up his face. Harry realizes that Peter's actually not so bad, so they fight Venom and Sandman, and Harry dies, but they killed Venom. And Peter forgives Sandman for killing Uncle Ben, since Sandman has a sick daughter. This is a hard plot to talk about because so much shit happens. Anyhow, as you can tell, there are 3 villains. So it was a little harder for them to flesh any single villain out the way the first 2 films did, with Green Goblin and Dr. Octopus respectively. Venom feels a bit rushed, and I honestly don't mind Sandman or New Goblin that much. New Goblin was a culmination of the entire trilogy, so he didn't need a ton of fleshing out in this movie to set up his motivations, and I think Flint's motivations are pretty well forecast in the film. Even though Eddie as Venom is a little rushed, his hatred makes sense, as he learns Peter's secret identity while getting the Venom symbiote, and Peter's the guy who basically stole his girlfriend and got him fired. So I really don't think the villains feel too rushed, like I've sometimes heard. and I especially like the culmination of Peter and Harry's arc. That said, once again, everything has to be closely connected to Peter and his drama. Harry was Peter's best friend, Eddie or Venom was a rival from the Daily Bugle, and happened to be dating Peter's lab partner and secondary love interest, Gwen Stacy. If that wasn't enough, Peter happens to show up at the same church Eddie is at to pull off the symbiote just for it to fall on Eddie and give him the Venom powers. And the symbiote rock pretty much lands right in Peter's lap in the first place. Flint happened to be the guy who killed Uncle Ben, which, can we just stop and acknowledge for a second, pretty much ruins Peter's core arc for the trilogy. Peter feels guilty for accidentally letting the guy go, and it is clearly on his conscience that he later killed the man who killed Uncle Ben, apparently. But Flint having done the killing makes it so that the killing pretty much wasn't Peter's fault in any way. Plus, he gives Peter a way to forgive the character and not have much culpability in killing who he thought was Uncle Ben's original killer, but rather it was just some crook. The melodrama in this film is as petty as ever, with Mary Jane just coming off as bitter and unlikable. Like at the start, Peter offers up a rational comparison to Mary Jane getting a bad review.
Listen, you are great. That's a critic. This is something you're gonna have to get used to. Believe me, I know. Spider-Man gets attacked all the time.
This isn't about you. This is about me.
Like, I don't get the appeal of this character or what they were thinking with her. I don't even really get why Peter loves her except for the fact that she's hot. All that said, the fights are really well done. The opening chase with Peter and Goblin is a highlight, and later when Peter fights Harry at his house was also super well done. I also think the last set piece in the building was pretty cool. The film also cranks the camp up more than ever. I'm personally team emo Peter Parker. I thought that shit was hilarious, and it fits well with the overall campy tone of the trilogy. I know it seems like I shit all over this film, but overall I kinda like it as part of the trilogy. It's like Return of the Jedi. Yeah, it's the worst in the trilogy by far, but that's only because it's compared to such great films. I don't think it would get as much hate as it does if it wasn't for that. And trust me, there are worse films to come in this series.
Somebody that just sold